LinkedIn presents.
I spent the year before the publication of Quiet in a state of quiet terror, let's say, because I knew I was going to have to give a TED Talk and I was going to have to give all these speeches and media and oh my gosh.
Welcome to Rethink Moments, the show that explores culturally significant ideas and events that in some way changed how we think and rethinks how these moments changed us. What went right? What went wrong? And what was learned? I'm your host, Rachel Botsman.
The night before my first TV show, I think I slept maybe 1 hour that night. It was really difficult at the beginning.
That's Susan Cain, arguably the world's most famous introvert. And of course, author of the hugely successful and seminal book, Quiet, a book that deeply connected with me and with millions of other people.
As an introvert who loves the years of splendid solitude writing the book, do you really want to be kind of the outward-facing face of this movement?
So I just published a book about introversion, and it took me about 7 years to write. And for me, that 7 years was like total bliss. But now, all of a sudden, my job is very different. And my job is to be out here talking about introversion.
Susan made a very important distinction between introversion and extroversion in a way that enabled people to really self-identify as to where they get their energy from.
And I was always going off to crowded bars when I really would have preferred to just have a nice dinner with friends. And I made these self-negating choices so reflexively that I wasn't even aware that I was making them. Now, this is what many introverts do.
Introverts, she explained, need a lot of alone time and prefer being with a smaller group of friends. They need time with their own thoughts to recharge. Extroverts, on the other hand, are more outgoing and love working and socializing in larger groups. They're energized in a packed, buzzing party.
I remember, going to dinner parties and things during the years that I was writing the book and feeling kind of reluctant to talk about it because it just seemed to me at the time like such a strange topic and that everybody would regard it that way. And it felt kind of embarrassing to me, honestly. And then I would talk about it and realize that rooms would come alive with like eagerness to explore this subject. And so I started to realize, oh, okay, not only is this something that many other people feel, but this is something people have been dying to talk about all this time, and we just never have. And I think that was the biggest aha moment for me.
Today on Rethink Moments, when an introvert is thrust into the spotlight, how does accepting who we are give us permission to show up in a different way? And when you're on a long creative journey, how do you have enough trust in yourself to enjoy the process? Stay with us. So it's interesting because it's a decade, right? Almost a decade since the book came out. And my first book came out, I think, a few months before yours, Susan. And I had this really interesting experience that one of the reasons I wanted to become a writer was because I enjoyed being by myself and with my thoughts. And when I wrote What's Mine Is Yours and then did a TED Talk, and then I remember the Wall Street Journal running this article saying that I was now the doyenne of the sharing economy, thinking, no, I don't want to be a champion of a movement. This was the last thing I intended to do. And then almost, your book fell in my lap and I carried it around talks and the book tour and everything. It became sort of like a comfort blanket in a way. And I know I'm not alone in having that experience of self-identification. And I've always wondered actually how that felt when millions of people were telling you that they self-identified with your idea.
Well, it was the most amazing thing in the world. It was the greatest gift imaginable. I mean, The letters that came in from people describing kind of what you just did, and so many of the letters use the word permission in that, I finally feel like I have permission to actually be myself. And many of them would express this paradox that the more they felt that permission, paradoxically, the more successful they suddenly were in the outer facing world. Like they were showing up to job interviews or first dates or whatever with a confidence that it was good to be who they were, and that made the interactions go well. And then there were like all these letters from people who would be in their 50s, 60s, 70s saying, if only I had had these ideas when I was younger, my whole life could have transpired differently. And now I'm going to share this with my children. I have goosebumps as I'm relating this to you. It's like the most incredible thing ever.
Susan's talking about the power and release that comes from accepting who you truly are. For some people, this new understanding of introversion made them rethink their lives. I suddenly realized why I had always struggled working in large organizations, why I found events with more than, say, 10 people utterly exhausting, and why all through my life there were always just a small handful of people whom I could really call true friends.
I think the biggest rethink moments that I had did come from talking about the ideas with other people, because although I believed very deeply in the principles that I explored in quiet, I was under the impression when I first started working on that book that, that this was a really idiosyncratic project and that it would be seen as kind of weird by the rest of the world. But I try to think of it kind of one person at a time, So like if I'm giving a talk, I famously overcame a great fear of public speaking. And it used to be that when I was giving a talk, I was so focused on how the audience might be judging whatever I was saying that I really shifted my focus to thinking, okay, there's probably at least one person in this audience whose life could be improved by what I'm going to say. And so I'm going to focus on that. But having said all that, I'm like incredibly, incredibly careful and protective over my private time. And even when I'm on the road, I'm always really careful to schedule in lots of time for room service in my hotel room and just, downtime in between interacting with people.
I think it's so interesting you describe this as a process and not an overnight transformation, because I think it's a mistake many people made. And I talk for myself that there were two things that really, really helped me. The first was that in many ways, I enjoyed the giving more than the receiving. I enjoyed giving these ideas to an audience I couldn't really take in. Oh, that's fantastic. Or when you get a great review, the giving meant more than the receiving, and that was okay. And then the second thing I think is really important is you learn the boundaries that are non-negotiable for you to be able to give and to continuously give. And I think that is really important. It doesn't matter if you're sort of a well-known speaker or a public figure or a leader. If you have to rise up in a way that feels like a step up, take it in as a process. It is a process of transformation, and figure out what those boundaries are for you. So I think that's really, really helpful advice.
That is an incredibly helpful insight. And I have to say, now, ironically, of course, I have this career as a public speaker where, over the last 10 years, I can't count the number of companies and organizations and schools I've spoken to, hundreds, thousands, I don't know. But I'm really careful when I do that to have a lot of downtime before a talk. I always have to be by myself, sitting quietly. And then afterwards, I always have to make sure that I'm going to be, alone with my room service at some point in the evening. And I really guard those boundaries carefully. I have to say it's easier to do that because since I'm there to speak about introversion, everybody knows that I need my recharge time. But everybody should be getting that recharge time, every single person. And in fact, one of the things that I saw from this pandemic is that some of my friends who are hyper extroverts started to feel that even for them, being in this quieter way of being was healthy and restorative. So that even for hyper extroverts, they have been living in a world that's too much 24/7. So we all need these extra boundaries.
Totally. Sometimes people think it's strange, right? Because they think, oh, you're so out there and it's so public on the stage and there's thousands of people watching you. And then you try to explain, well, actually, no, that's a very private space. You're almost in a bubble that you're fully in control of. It's the moment you step off the stage that people can come up to you. That for me was the challenge. So I think that's really helpful for people to hear. It ties to something I've been curious to ask you about, and that's the concept of introversion and extroversion really being thrown into the spotlight during the pandemic. I've noticed all around me, including myself, people searching for answers and trying to understand their response and complex relationship to uncertainty. Did you find, Susan, that there was new interest or a different reaction to the book during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't only the uncertainty, I would say. It was just the fact of people spending so much more time on their own or with small circles of their pods or loved ones or families or whatever than they had before. And so that naturally gives rise to the question of, well, do I like this new state of being? Or is there something, even aside from all the sorrows and the difficulties involved with it, is there something that I like about this new state of being? Is there something that we want to carry forward to when things hopefully return to normal? And yeah, all of that just naturally kind of filters through a lens of introversion. And everybody assumed at the beginning that introverts would be the most comfortable with the pandemic. And in some ways that has been true. But there's also a way in which introverts, particularly highly sensitive introverts, do react more intensely to some of life's overwhelms. So there are ways in which the pandemic turned out to be more taxing for introverts, with greater levels of anxiety and so on that were being reported. So I think these things are pretty complicated.
In so many ways, the pandemic has given us time and space to think about the type of people that we want to be, instead of what we want to do or what we want to achieve, to stop being in this continuous rush motion of wanting to achieve the next goal. It's been a catalyst for many people, including myself, to focus on more meaningful things. More after this short break. You know what's really interesting, Susan, is when I read your book 10 years ago and then I reread it before this conversation, I'd never picked up on this. I felt like you were writing about humility. And I wonder if you've thought more about this connection between humility and introversion.
That's really interesting. And I don't know exactly what the data says on the connection between introversion and humility, but I can tell you anecdotally that there is one. Because, if you're an introvert, and particularly, so shyness and introversion are not the same thing, as we know, but there's a big overlap. And certainly there's a cultural overlap in that shy people are seen as introverted and vice versa. And certainly shyness comes with a kind of innate humility, because what are you as a shy person? You're somebody who cares a little bit too much what other people might think. You're a little bit too anxious, maybe, of your place in the social hierarchy, a little bit too worried about being toppled from that place. When that's too extreme, that's obviously a very painful place to be. But when you have a kind of mild amount of shyness, I wish the world had more of a mild amount of shyness, because it's also a way of paying respect to other people. It's giving credit to other people, and there's something that we all need in that. And I think that that's probably some of the connection with humility.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way I think of humility is a confident relationship with what we don't know. And I've wondered whether introverts are more comfortable in that place of not knowing because their version of confidence is very different from an extrovert.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. And in fact, when you said that, the quote that came to my mind, I'm trying to remember now who said this, but the quote is, Some people are more certain of everything than I am of anything.
Yep.
And this was a quote that was said by somebody who's very prominent and powerful. And I was really struck by it. And I think it's a kind of intellectual habit, right?
Susan's referring to a quote by Robert Rubin, the former US Secretary of the Treasury, taken from his book, which I absolutely love, called In an Uncertain World.
And maybe the connection with introversion is if you're comfortable and actually love the process of spending a lot of time roaming around inside your own mind, then certainty is not what you're after. What you're after is the process of the roaming. You're after the adventure, whether it's an intellectual adventure or an emotional adventure inside your own mind. And none of that depends on actually knowing the answer. It's exactly the opposite.
I read that it took you 7 years to finish Quiet. And part of what you enjoy is moving slowly. So when I read this, I had two thoughts, two questions. The first is, when you're on these journeys to understand these topics that are often about sort of the misunderstood or the misappreciated qualities of humans, how do you trust yourself over that period of time that you're traveling in the right direction?
That is such a good question. So there's kind of a macro answer to that question and the micro answer. The macro answer is, I think with both of my bigger books, with Quiet and now with Bittersweet, I am answering a question and expressing ideas that I have felt deeply and in my soul from the time I was very, very young. So it's not like I'm questioning myself at that level. I just know these things to be true when I'm writing. And I guess I've also talked to enough other people to know that I'm not alone in perceiving things this way. But the truth is, I think even if I didn't talk to all those other people, I just know it so deeply and fundamentally. And then the micro answer to that question is that it's usually really easy for me to figure out what stories to tell and what research to do, because I'm just kind of following my nose on that. But then I take all those stories and the research and think, okay, now how do I present this in a way that expresses the idea that I am, yearning to express? And that takes a really long time. It's like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle.
Is the journey more important than the bestseller?
Honestly, they're both important. I mean, I feel like the right answer to that question is the journey is more important. And yes, in a fundamental way it is. But of course, especially if you're somebody like me who spends so many years on each project, of course you want it to reach as many people as you can. Now, that is definitely true. Having said that, it's also true that, there's that expression in Judaism, if you've saved one life, you've saved the whole world. And so I'm going to say analogously, for me, the great thing in reading and writing alike, the great thing is the magical moment when there's a kind of connection between the reader and the writer. And it's like the writer has expressed something that the reader has always felt, but never quite articulated in just that way, or never thought to articulate. I've had those moments as a reader all my life. And I think that's what made me become a writer in the first place, because to me, those moments are the kind of highest state imaginable.
It's I was thinking about both the books and your other books as well. And something that really struck me as a thread was this idea of dualities, that in so much of your writing, you are looking at sort of the overlooked or misunderstood through the lens of duality. So introversion, extroversion, the positive and the negative, darkness and light, sorrow and longing. Is that something intentional, or is that just the way you think?
Your questions are so amazing. I've done a million interviews over the last 10 years, and I don't know, your questions are posed by a writer / theologian / psychotherapist asking for a business site.
I really appreciate that. But I should ask, is that my observation, or do you feel like there is a desire to unpack these dualities?
Well, It's not something that I've thought about consciously, but you're right that that's what I do. It's not like I go in thinking, I'm now going to consider the question of dualities. I never think about it consciously, but yeah. I mean, so for example, with Bittersweet, the book ended up becoming all about the way in which we all exist in a constant state that's both joy and sorrow. And that's how it is, and that's how it should be. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, and we should embrace it. But it didn't really start by my desire to answer that question. It really started because all my life I've had an incredibly intense and uplifting and almost ecstatic response to hearing bittersweet minor key music. And I could not understand why that should be so. Like, it just didn't make sense that music that was inherently minor key, meant to make you feel unsettled and like things weren't quite right. Why would that be the music that would produce these feelings of awe and transcendence? And that was the question I wanted to answer. I guess when you look at it, embedded in that question is really duality and light and dark, but I wasn't thinking that way when I first started.
I put this to you as a bit of a challenge because I think when you are talking about dualities or opposites, and I had to resist actually doing this when I was reading Bittersweet, is that there is a temptation to, how can I put it, to stereotype and self-identify in a way that is potentially unhealthy. Have there been moments where people, or there's been a discussion around the identity around introversion and extroversion that has made you uncomfortable?
Yes. People will sometimes push back and say, I don't like these labels and we shouldn't be labeled in this way. To which I would say, you're right. The point isn't to label you, and labels can be very constricting if that's all we're doing with this knowledge. I do think there's something incredibly powerful of understanding our own tendencies and our own preferences of how we like to spend our time, and the elements of our nature that make us find one experience meaningful and another experience tiresome. Like, that's incredibly important to know. And at the same time, of course, we all contain multitudes, when it comes to introversion, extroversion, like Carl Jung, who popularized those terms, said there is no such thing as an all introvert or an all extrovert. He said that such a person would be in a lunatic asylum. So the point isn't to say that we're all one thing or we're all another, but just to note these directions in our nature. And similarly with Bittersweet, what I ended up concluding is that like the ultimate point is transcendence of all of it somehow. But it's only if you're embracing both the light and the dark and the bitter and the sweet, and really accepting that that's part of you and that's part of reality and that's part of this world. That's paradoxically when you feel like you're starting to approach a greater sense of transcendence. So when I say how sorrow and longing can make us whole, the point isn't to advocate living in a state of sorrow and longing. It's rather to understand that sorrow and longing are part of reality that we need to embrace along with the other stuff.
I'm not sure why, but my mind connected Bittersweet with a concept the great romantic poet John Keats came up with over 200 years ago called negative capability. Keats was fascinated by what made really great creative minds capable of being in the space of uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. Geniuses such as Shakespeare. He had this brilliant idea that he called negative capability, where he said so much of our lives and our minds, the way we're trained, the way we're taught, focuses on positive capabilities, doing stuff, being productive, confidently getting things done. It leads to an almost unbearable pressure to be fast and decisive. Yet the true meaning of capability, I learned, is actually about space. It's the ability to hold much. And as I was reading Susan's work, this idea of negative capability kept coming back to me accepting or embracing the space beyond what we know, about how we make room for the perceived negatives as much as the positives in our lives. So I was interested to ask Susan what negative capabilities she would want people to rethink through her new work.
Well, I'd like people, first and foremost, to make friends with the side of themselves that is bittersweet and melancholic, and to see that side of themselves as one of their great powers, as one of the elements in them that leads to creativity and to connection and to transcendence. Those three things: creativity, connection, and transcendence. Those are all facilitated by the bittersweet in ourselves and the melancholic in ourselves. And I know we don't normally think of it that way, but that is so. So I want people to know that that's true, and then to be thinking about, okay, well, what could you do with that side of yourself? And to think, what is the pain that you can't get rid of? And I say to people, whatever that pain is, take it and make that your creative offering. And by creative offering, I don't necessarily mean writing a book or a poem or a piece of music, but what is the thing that you're generating in this world? It's probably, when you look at it, it is probably coming from the place inside you that is longing for a world that is more perfect and more beautiful than the one we're in right now. The side of you that knows that the things are fundamentally fallen in a certain way, and that's okay, that's the way it is. But the thing in you that is yearning for it to be better and different, that's actually one of your best selves.
Mm-hmm. I'm not just saying this, but the line I actually underlined from the book is exactly what you just said. Whatever the pain you can't get rid of, make it your creative offering. It's the line that most deeply connected with me. I destroy books, I have to say, so I underline them. But that is an underline, a love heart, and an asterisk, because I think the essence of the book is in that line. That line is everything.
I love to know that. As I was writing it, I was like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Wow, I loved that conversation so much. And Susan's new book, Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, is a beautiful rethink read. I'd highly recommend it. If you're enjoying Rethink Moments, please hit subscribe and do leave us a review. And I'd also love for you to keep rethinking with me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn at Rachel Botsman, and here you can join a community of rethinkers by subscribing to the Rethink Moments newsletter. And you can email me with your ideas, questions, experiences, and any feedback on rachel@rethinkmoments.com. I'm Rachel Botsman. Join me again on Rethink Moments, and thanks for listening. Rethink Moments is truly a collective effort. The show is developed and written by me, Rachel Botsman, with Will Hain and Alex Sansom. Our Rethink Moments team includes our wonderful producers, Kat Davey and Karenza Metric, and Phoebe Adler-Ryan, our researcher. Editing, mixing, and additional scripting is by our friends at Rethink Audio, Matt Hill and Anushka Tate. Sound engineering by Nick Morbath at Evolution Studios, and our original theme music is composed by Ben Sansom. And thanks to Jessie Hempel and the team at LinkedIn for all their support.